The 19th century saw many changes in the instrumental culture of Italy. The history of the flute provides a glimpse into the pressures and changing demands that many musicians faced, which ranged from changing instrument technologies to the rise of the amateur market, a preference for virtuosity, to the institutionalization and standardization of musical education. Many flutists were not only virtuosi and opera or band musicians, but also composers, pedagogues, teachers, inventors, critics, music theorists, and one was even a doctor. The rise of music as a commercial enterprise necessitated a career comprising many different elements, and flutists had to adapt to this new reality. Despite the ever-shifting musical world these flutists operated in, there's been little research into how these flutists adapted and what impact these adaptations had on musical life more generally. In what little scholarship there is about flutes and flutists in Italy, most of which is only available in Italian, one name that continuously pops up is Giulio Briccialdi, frequently listed as one of the most important and influential Italian flutists. Through Briccialdi, we can get a peek at how many Italian musicians adjusted to the changes that they confronted throughout their careers. The impact that these changes had still influences the way we do music today, from the music we play to the instruments we use. These transformations did not only influence the physical scores and instruments, but also the performance practices. This was the age of the virtuoso musician, a development that made today the modern day virtuoso musician possible. Briccialdi began his flute studies with his father, but these lessons do not seem to have lasted long, as many sources from the time claim Briccialdi was essentially a self-taught flutist. He moved to Rome around 1833, where he joined the Accademia di Santa Cecilia and a theater orchestra. Although most flutists studied at conservatories, it seems Briccialdi's only formal musical training happened in the 4 years he spent at the Accademia. This is about 2 or 3 years less than most students spent studying at conservatories, where musical education was typically 6 to 7 years. He then moved to Naples in 1873, where he taught flute to the king's brother. This is a relatively common phenomenon towards the beginning of the 19th century, as much of a musician's income would have come from working for the nobility. Briccialdi also spent some time in London, where he constructed the first flute with his now famous B-flat thumb key with the company Rudal and Rose. And he eventually settled in Florence, where he taught at the Istituto Musicale from 1870 until his death in 1880, and patented his own model of flute. Throughout much of his career, he published his compositions and gave concerts throughout Italy, Europe, and America, and played first flute in various theaters. However, he never settled into one particular theater, which is relatively uncommon for the time, and in some senses prefigures the modern freelance musician. The 19th century saw a boom in flute building in Italy, a result of a number of interrelated factors. This was the time period that saw the rise of music as a major commercial enterprise, not only with music publishing, but also with instrument making. In addition, the flute was becoming more prominent in the orchestra and had to play music that was increasingly virtuosic and chromatic, both orchestral and solo. These changes required a flute that could play in any key, something that the old system fingerings made quite challenging, particularly in the flat keys. This is not to mention the industrialization of instruments that resulted in modifications across the board in how instruments were produced. Italian flutists, despite these many new models, retained the old system flutes much longer than German, French, or English flutists. They did not take on the Böhm flute in large numbers until the beginning of the 20th century, and the most popular flutes were the first two in this chart, the old system and the Ziegler, which were both conical and made of wood. Even after a majority of flutists adopted the Böhm flute in the 20th century, Italian flutists generally still tended to prefer the wooden instruments over metal ones. And just to note that the dates in this chart are the earliest and latest references I could find to each flute's use in Italy, so some may have been used earlier or later than I have indicated. One of the few major changes to Böhm's flute since 1847 was Briccialdi's invention of the B-flat thumb key in 1849, and you can see it here. His goal was to facilitate playing in flat keys by providing alternate fingering for B-flat. As a flutist myself, I can attest to the fact that this key does, in fact, make those keys easier to play. Böhm would later invent his own B-flat thumb key, seen here, but he put it lower down on the flute. It was Briccialdi's design that won out and is standard on modern instruments. Briccialdi was also the one of the first flutists in Italy to start using the bone flute. He encountered an early model in Livorno in 1833 and was surprised by the sonority. 14 years later, he went to Munich, where Böhm gave him one of his first 1847 models. Briccialdi wrote in 1873 that he liked the tone of the instrument, the increased volume, and the ease of intonation, but found it too difficult to adapt to the fingering system. As a result, he decided to experiment with a way to combine Böhm's invention with a fingering system that's closer to old system flutes. And in 1869, he revealed his new flute, which had a mechanism that retained many of the older fingerings, but was cylindrical and metal like Böhm's. And here we have a flute made by Emilio Piana in 1899. Briccialdi's flute was adopted by the Reale Istituto Musicale di Firenze in 1874, but the flute was also produced in both Naples and Milan, and was made as late as the 1930s in Florence. The distribution and frequency of the production of Briccialdi's flutes shows the popularity of the instrument. However, after the 1930s, there is no evidence of the flute being made, and the Böhm flute became the dominant instrument in Italy, like it had in most other places in Europe. Very few of Briccialdi's flutes survive, and no fingering charts exist that I could find. The flute was praised for its perfect intonation, which was even better than Böhm's in the third octave, and fingerings that were much easier than the older flutes. As I was digging through Italian journals in the 19th century, I noticed that at first, many of the articles favored the Briccialdi flute over the Böhm. However, over a few weeks in 1874, the two models became the focus of a heated debate in a series of letters published in the Gazzetta Musicale di Milano. There were several key points of debate between the two flutes: intonation, fingerings and mechanisms, tone quality, open versus closed keys, and the fact that the Briccialdi flute was an Italian invention. Several people entered on both sides of the debate, comparing every aspect of the two instruments, sometimes despite not having ever actually played one or the other model. Briccialdi himself entered the debate on two separate occasions, seemingly personally offended by the negative comments made about his flute. In his letter of September 9th, he wrote, "Right now in some journals, people are amusing themselves by mistreating my poor flute, which has done no wrong other than being my son." He highlighted the difficulties associated with the Böhm flute, including contrary movements required for many fingering changes, before emphasizing the similarities between the two flutes: intonation, homogeneity of tone, and the quality and quantity of the sound. He also asked other flutists to stop comparing the two. A few letters later, on September 28th, Briccialdi published his second letter, which would prove to be the final in the debate. This was a response to a letter claiming his mechanism caused him to stop playing at the Teatro alla Fenice. Briccialdi insisted that the issue was caused by the embouchure made by another maker and not his mechanism. He also asserted that artists should make their own decisions about which flute was best for them, and that it was useless to argue about it. He continued to say that he would not force anyone, not even his own students, to use his flute, and went as far as to say, "Those who like my invention, adopt it. Those who don't like it, leave it alone." This debate demonstrates the aspects of the flute that Italian flutists cared about most, with tone quality and fingerings being the two most frequently mentioned issues. Like the physical instruments, flute music in Italy exploded in the 19th century, likely as a result of the increased demand by amateur musicians. Both virtuosi and amateurs wrote solo and chamber music for the flute, and the increased importance and power of the publishing houses enabled music to become an economic endeavor, as well as an artistic one. One thing most of this repertoire has in common is that it was generally written by flutist composers, with very few pieces written by non-flutists. Composing became a way for flutists to express themselves and demonstrate their musical personality, all while increasing their income. The vast majority of the repertoire was based on operas, fantasies, paraphrases, transcriptions, potpourris, and variations on themes from operas abound. I want to turn my attention now to two pieces that Briccialdi wrote in the 1850s and 60s that show his two different styles of writing. The first of these is the 1861 piece, Le Atwali Mozioni d'Italia, Opus 103, an example of a virtuosic suite with an introduction and 6 episodes. I argue that the third episode of the piece, entitled Tarantella Originale, suggests that the piece was meant primarily for amateur performance. Although the episode is fast, the fact that the flute's triplets are mostly neighbor tones make the piece sound much harder than it is. This indicates that perhaps Briccialdi envisioned a piece that sounded virtuosic, but that amateur musicians could still perform. The difficulty would change depending on the model of the flute being used, but for most fingering systems, notes that are closer together require movement of fewer fingers than notes that are further apart, making it easier to play. And I'll just play this so you can hear how it sounds virtuosic, but I can tell you it actually isn't that hard to play. The final section of the piece, based on the popular Inno di Garibaldi, similarly seems to indicate that Briccialdi intended the piece for amateurs. It is a virtuosic sounding showpiece for flutists to demonstrate their technical and musical abilities from start to finish, although the scales and arpeggios in this section likely would not have been too difficult for amateurs. The exception to this starts from right about here, where there's a series of wide leaps that are also slurred, and those do get a little more challenging. But overall, once again, Briccialdi's composition sounds harder than it is, allowing amateur flutists to play repertoire that sounded virtuosic and impressed their friends and family. Perhaps Briccialdi wanted to write a piece that more people could play to promote the idea of Italian unification. In any case, it is clear that he knew how to write for the flute as he balances the technically challenging moments with the less challenging to give the flutist an opportunity to rest after harder sections. This is particularly evident with the longer piano interludes after the tarantella and halfway through the last episode. And I will just play the first half of that last episode and just ignore the little flubs. This was at the end of a very long recital, so I was a little mentally and physically exhausted by this point. Like le Atwali Mozioni d'Italia, Briccialdi's Fantasia Sola Traviata, Opus 76, is in the form of a suite with an introduction and 4 numbers from the opera. The opus number indicates that it was likely written sometime around the 1850s, probably after the 1854 successful revival of the opera. The final section in particular suggests that Briccialdi had a more advanced flutist in mind than he did with le Atwali Mozioni. He bases the section on the Act 3 duet, Parigio cara, noi lasceremo. After presenting the theme, the flute launches immediately into a number of variations on different phrases of the duet. This is the most technically challenging section of the piece. In fact, when I programmed it on my senior recital, I cut the last 2 pages of the piece because they were so hard. From leaps to trills, arpeggios to scales, and double tonguing to triple tonguing, he allows the flutist to demonstrate not only their ability to play technical passages, but also their ability to play musically while playing those passages. The section is also quite chromatic, with a general preference for flats over sharps, and has a final cadenza that spans nearly the entire range of the instrument. Now I'm just going to start from the second to last, or the fourth to last line on this first page. This last section in particular suggests that Briccialdi was writing for a more advanced flutist than the Atwali Moziani. The piece is much more technically demanding and does not rely as much on the simpler neighbor tones, scales, and arpeggios. Additionally, he limits the Atwali Moziani to the keys of A major, A minor, and C major, all of which are relatively simple to play, both on Böhm flutes and the older flutes. The piece is also mostly diatonic, and any accidentals, if present, are for the most part sharps with a few exceptions. And these sharps are generally speaking less awkward to play on the older model flutes than the flats. The Fantasia, on the other hand, includes more challenging keys such as F minor and G minor. This preference for flat keys combined with the increased chromaticism would have made this piece quite challenging on many of the flutes that were preferred by the Italians, as they would have required quite a few awkward fingering combinations. This is not to mention other technical challenges that Briccialdi included in the Fantasia and not in Le Attuali Emozioni. For example, the prevalence of wide leaps in the former. Although some aspects of his career do veer slightly from the typical path of a 19th century flutist in Italy, Briccialdi exemplifies the general trajectory of a flutist's career. He began learning flute from his father, studied at the Accademia in Rome, taught royalty, played in the opera house, published both didactic and concert works, taught at a conservatory, and invented his own flute. Through his example, we can see not only how musicians had to adapt to a change. Through his example, we can see not only the typical career path, but also how musicians had to adapt to a changing musical scene. As the money in music shifted from the nobility to the opera houses and music publishers, so too did the attention of the musicians shift. Briccialdi went from teaching nobility to playing in the opera houses and publishing his own music. The evolving instrument technologies led to the creation of many different models of instruments, including Briccialdi's 1869 flute. Finally, the increase in music consumers, particularly amateur musicians, required professional musicians to publish works for both themselves to play, but also easier works that amateur musicians could purchase and play at home. Many of these changes were not musically driven, but instead resulted from outside factors, be they technological, social, or economic, and their impact can still be felt today, from the pedagogical works young musicians study to the instruments that they play. The developments and subsequent debates that occurred in the 19th century created shockwaves that forever changed the way music was produced and consumed, and has helped lead us to where we are now, still striving for perfection and virtuosity, with a plethora of repertoire to choose from when putting together a recital program or preparing for a competition. Thank you.